Hi everyone, Chat Sematary is back and we have a new guest on the show, Becky Kovach. I have talked to her on my other podcast, Welcome to Geekdom, but this is her first appearance here to talk about The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger, which is the first book in a very epic series. Becky, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am very excited to get going on this series, even though it's going to be a long time before I make my way through it, just because of how spread out it is as far as in King's bibliography.
Yeah, and there's so much within like this series too that it's a lot to unpack and try and dive into all of it. So it takes a while.
Exactly. I know this is pretty much one of the only things you have started reading from Stephen King because horror isn't quite your cup of tea. So, what was it that drew you to the Dark Tower storyline?
Truthfully, it was recommended to me
Okay.
by Gus from Young Guns, band from the UK that I worked with a couple years back. He was a really big reader, and we had a press day, and we were hanging out, and we were just kind of talking about books. And he talked so highly of this series that I figured it had to be worth at least giving it a shot.
Did you read The Stand before you dove into the Dark Tower books, or is that something that you didn't really know was connected at first?
So I didn't know it was connected at first.
Okay.
And I did start reading the first Dark Tower series book, but then before I even got halfway through it, somebody pointed out my mistake and insisted that I go back and read The Stand before I continue with the Dark Tower series.
Yeah, I didn't really know that it was connected either, but because I went back and started going through all of this chronologically, luckily I ended up reading it first anyway, and it is massive to say the least, which can be said for a lot of these Dark Tower books, but with The Gunslinger, this is actually pretty short as far as Stephen King standards go.
Yeah, The Stand was huge and literally took me forever to get through. And I think of myself as being a pretty quick reader.
I would agree with you on that. You do read very quickly.
That was just like a beast. And then to switch gears and go back to the Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger, I think my copy was like 200 pages, maybe, which is short in comparison to, of course, The Stand,
Right.
but also a lot of the things that I tend to read are all in more like the 400 or 500s.
Yeah, my copy was a little over 300 pages, but the font was a lot bigger than it usually is with some of his mass market paperback books. I don't know why that one was so different, but it was a very quick read, and mine had illustrations at the top of each, chapter and
Okay.
everything like that. I had things taking up a little more space here and there, but overall, it was, a few sittings and I was pretty much done with it. And I think it was just a great introduction to these characters and especially the man in black going a little more in depth off of what we learned of him in The Stand. But you have Roland Duchesne. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I looked it up and no one could agree on how his last name was pronounced. So we're just going to go with Roland going forward because that's a little easier. But
Yeah.
he is the gunslinger. So he is the focus of this story and it's being told from his perspective in a flashback. And within the flashback, you have flashbacks. So there's a lot going on here, but you get a good sense of who this character is. And with the flashbacks within the flashbacks, you're getting this sense of how he grew up and why he became the way he is today. And I just thought that was a very interesting way to tell this story because he doesn't really seem like the kind of guy who is into telling stories. There are certain people who are just so excited to tell you every single story they possibly
Yeah.
know. And then there are some people who are a little more closed off and they're like, I don't really have anything to tell you.
Yeah, he definitely comes across as a man of few words. So the fact that he sits down at this farm with some stranger he just met and insists on telling him, or he doesn't insist, the farmer who is putting him up for the night asks him to tell his story. But the fact that he sits down and he agrees to talk through the night and tell how he got there is kind of shocking when you think about the kind of person that Roland comes across as being. But the cool thing with the way this book is set up and the way the story is told with all of these flashbacks within flashbacks is it definitely sets up the series as being very heavily dependent on time and timelines and the fact that the world has moved on, which is something that comes up a lot, and that time isn't quite what it should be. So I just thought that was really cool.
The way that he tweaks with things while he's writing, especially The Man in Black, it's just so interesting because you're like, what is even going on at times? And even though this set of events has already happened and Roland is telling it to someone in the future, pretty much, because well, I wouldn't say the future, but in the present day, he's telling someone this story. But it almost feels like it's the future because you get so sucked into the story that you feel like you're there at that time when he's going through the town of Tull, staying there for a while, having this not so healthy relationship with the barmaid Alice. And then he comes across Sylvia, and it just goes very wrong very quickly as soon as that encounter happens. And then he's off to go find the Man in Black. And you just get so engrossed in the story that he's telling that it almost feels like it's happening in the present day.
Yeah, it definitely drags you back to that time with him. So that as he's reliving it, you kind of feel like you're there with him as it's happening, which is cool. But then, like you said, it all ends very, very badly. I think he ends up killing like the entire town.
He does. And then he just kind of goes on his merry way. And that's when he comes across Jake Chambers. He is this kid in the desert, kind of just surviving on whatever has been left for him. And he's the only one around. So he naturally wants some company. So he ends up tagging along with Roland. Even though the Man in Black had come before Roland, he didn't feel as inclined to go with the Man in Black. And I just thought that was really interesting because then, they talk about how the Man in Black kind of planted the kid there to have him go with Roland and put Roland through this sort of emotional ride because he does start to care for the kid. And that's something that I think Stephen King always has an interesting take on is these relationships with kids, whether it's a group of kids or, a kid looking up to an adult or even kids being ignored by adults. You sort of get that in a lot of his stories where there's a significant relationship with a kid and, completely platonic for for the most part from what I've read so far anyway. So it's not anything creepy, but you have him as a father like figure in this. And he's not really father material by any means.
No, far from it. You said, like you said earlier, this is kind of the first foray of mine into Stephen King's work, so I can't really speak to like adult child relationships in his other works and how it compares to this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Jake very much kind of takes to Roland and starts to look up to him as sort of a father figure. And Roland does start to care for Jake, and it's very uncharacteristic of him, especially as a gunslinger. It's kind of not frowned upon for gunslingers to have emotional connections, but it does tend to hinder their abilities to do their jobs. So it's something that, the Man in Black is very much aware of. And he uses Jake as a way to kind of test Roland and his resolve in his quest, which is to find the Dark Tower.
Even though we don't get a lot of the Man in Black, just the fact that he is able to mess with Roland's mind in that way too tells you a lot about the character. And we do get that moment where the two of them meet and they are, sort of in the same room together, but Roland is just being tortured by not being able to know what day it is, and he feels like 10 years have passed by the time he's able to go back outside, and it's just completely engrossing when you're following these two characters, or three if you even want to include Jake in that, because he does become such a big part of Roland's journey for at least this portion of it. And obviously that also ends badly.
Yeah, it ends with Roland letting Jake kind of fall to his death in a dark cave under a mountain, something like that.
It's right when they get to the tower area. And I just imagine the tower just sitting on this big giant mountain. And I haven't seen the movie adaptation or anything like that. And I heard I probably don't
Same.
want to, but eventually I will get to that for the purpose of this podcast. So I don't know how they visualized it in the movie just yet. But to me, it's always been sort of this tall mountain that narrows a lot, and the tower just kind of sits at the top of that. And then underneath, you sort of just have all these dark aspects to it. So to me, that's where, Jake fell.
Yeah, I think that's kind of how I pictured it when I was reading through. But so the thing with this series is his quest is to find the Dark Tower. He
Right.
doesn't find it in this book. It's a very, very long journey. But he has to sacrifice Jake on his way to get there to kind of prove his resolve to get there. And Walter takes that and uses it to his advantage. Walter being the Man in Black. He has so many names.
Yeah, because he looks familiar to Roland, and Roland asks him who he is. And when he gives the name Walter, something clicks. And, the flashbacks within the flashbacks kind of tell you a lot about how Roland was brought up, his training, and the man who came and kind of split up his father and his mother. So you have Martin, who's sort of inserting himself in Roland's life for a reason, and Walter is aware of that. And I think there is so much in this that I probably didn't even catch on to just yet because I haven't read any of the other books other than The Stand. But I'm really looking forward to where things go from here as far as the plot goes, because to me it seems like the Man in Black has so much that he can manipulate, especially if he knows someone's history like he seems to with the Gunslinger.
Well, they end up revealing that the Man in Black, Walter, is Martin.
Yes, right.
So their paths have been intertwined since Roland's childhood, even though Roland wasn't aware of it back then and wasn't aware of it until Walter tells him, like, "Oh no, that was me."
Yeah, so he's been inserting himself in Roland's life since not necessarily the very beginning, but pretty early on without having him realize it. So, he was what, maybe a teenager in the flashbacks during the flashback. So to have him then go off on his own in those flashbacks and think, he kind of knows more than the teacher. I thought that was interesting too, because you can see how ruthless he is from the start, pretty much, when he's training and everything like that. And he just has this determination that you don't see in characters all the time. And I would say that his determination rivals that of the Man in Black, but the Man in Black is a little more clever about on how he goes about doing things, because like you said, he has a lot of names, which is why I can't keep them straight. So he is Walter and Martin and the Man in Black. And
He's also like the walking dude.
yeah, I think they
Going
called him
back to The
something else
Stand.
in The Stand. Yeah, that sounds about right, but don't quote me on that because I'm already lost on how many names this guy has.
It does, yeah, it doesn't help that he has a million names, and also, like, in The Stand especially, there's a million characters
Yeah, he's Randall
to try and keep
Flagg.
straight.
So that is the name I mostly know of as the Man in Black up to this
Yes,
point. So then to have him be Walter.
and
Oh
Martin.
my goodness. If you I just looked at the list of aliases that he uses, and it's like, I don't know, 20, 30 names long. So
Don't they also call him Merlin at some point? Am I making that up?
I'm not 100% sure on that. Let's see. There's the Man in Black, Randall Flagg, the Ageless Stranger, the Walking Dude, the Dark Man, Beelzebub. I don't even. I
Oh, that's like a name for, like, the devil.
Yeah, he's the monster, the man with no face. There's so many here. I didn't even name half of them. So I have my work cut out for me with trying to keep all of his aliases straight. So, thankfully, the Stephen King Wikia page here is very helpful. If anyone has not checked that out yet and is a fan of Stephen King, I highly recommend doing so, because it has all sorts of fun little connections and tidbits that I didn't necessarily catch on to with some of the stuff. And, you know, this is what, the first of 8 books now, I want to say, for the Dark Tower so far.
Yes, but I think there's like a weird point where there's like 5 and then 5.5 and then 6 or something like that.
Yeah, and I think the half one came out after the rest or something like that. I don't know. It is very strange, but I have all of them. I just need to like go double check what the order is before I get to them so I don't mess anything up, because, with Stephen King, sometimes he will write things very early on, but then they don't get published until after stuff he had written after it, and it's a little confusing. So that's why I'm just going with the straight up release dates. And this was released on June 10th, 1982. So the release date is what I'm going with here, and hopefully it doesn't take me too terribly long to get to the next book. I think the next book came out, what I want to say, at least a few years later.
Something like that.
It came out 5 years later. So I actually have a lot in between the two books, but thankfully a good chunk of them are movies, so that will be a little easier for me. But I think with The Gunslinger, this is a really good look at more of the character work that Stephen King likes to do. I know you haven't read many of his books outside of the Dark Tower series, but if you get around to it, I know I gave you a list of like the non-horror stuff so
Yes.
that it'll be a little easier for you to get into like some of the detective stories or something like that. But one of the things that I pay attention to a lot is the character work that he does, because of the fact that his universe is so interconnected, whether you sort of realize it or not at times. He has this thing about him where he just puts in all of these little details. And I wouldn't say I'm the biggest Stephen King fan by any means. I know there are fans out there who know a lot more than I do about his work, but it's just so fascinating to me to see what he is able to do with these characters and how he's able to take them and put them in these other stories that don't always seem related. The Stand didn't really seem related to this at all, but you have this one character who kind of pulls it all together, and you're like, oh, okay, I can kind of see how he got from being Randall Flagg and being in The Stand to then being the Man in Black in this story.
Yeah, and The Stand also sets up the world in which the Gunslinger and the Dark Tower series takes place, where there's this super virus that kind of takes out the majority of the population, and the rest of the world that's left behind has to figure out how to survive and move on, which, like I said before, is kind of a recurring thing within the Dark Tower series of like the world has moved on, like time has moved on.
Exactly. I want to talk a little more specifically about the characters themselves. I know we've kind of gone over the plot probably as much as we need to before we dive into some more details here, but the Gunslinger, I've mentioned, we get a lot of his history in this, and we get exactly what we need from the Man in Black to not only get a better sense of who he is, but to also still keep the mystery going. We don't know what all the Man in Black is capable of still. We just know
No.
he's capable of a lot of things that suck for everyone else.
Yeah, he kind of like hints at what he's capable of, and the fact that he kind of is able to pull Jake into this world from elsewhere hints at a little bit of what his powers are, but you don't get the full sense of it yet.
Exactly. I want to talk a little more specifically about Jake too, because he's the character we see the most of outside of the Gunslinger. And he's not in the entire novel. It takes a little while before we get to the point in the story where he meets Jake, but then he's on this long journey with Roland, and you just really get a sense of the spectrum of emotions that the kid is feeling. You have him where he's, just sort of ready and rearing to go and wants to kind of keep trudging along. and he has all this energy and everything like that. And then you have other times where he's scared and he just wants Roland to stay with him and take care of him. And I think the range of emotion that Stephen King shows with Jake just goes to show how unpredictable having a kid tag along can be, because he's not going to be as composed as Roland. Roland has been trained for things like this, whereas Jake is sort of just this chess piece that the Man in Black is using, but it's still so effective against Roland.
Yeah, it has much more of an effect on Roland than he even realizes it's going to as things are happening. And, by the end of the book, you can tell how much having to sacrifice Jake has, affected him mentally and emotionally. And he he thought he was prepared to do whatever it took to get to the Dark Tower, but this is the first thing really. Like he killed an entire town and just kept moving. But the loss of this one kid really has a huge effect on him.
Obviously, Jake had a different significance to him, too. You know, the people in Tull all turned on him and attacked him because of the fact that they all thought he was like a demon and whatnot and everything like that. So they were going to try and take him out. Clearly, it did not work. But because he grew attached to Jake, and the funny thing is, Jake was already dead. So it was basically a dead boy dying again that made him feel all of these emotions, which is another thing that's interesting because he talks about his own death when they, not right when they first meet, but when they're at the way station.
Yeah, he does remember his own death, but it's weird because then he meets Roland and it seems like he's very much alive. Like he seems
Yeah.
like he's a living, breathing person, and it's hard to tell the difference and if he actually is real or if he's just some kind of tool that the Dark Man is using against Roland. But the emotions that Roland attaches to him are very real and have a huge impact on him.
Yeah, one of the other things I think that is different with the Dark Tower series is the fantasy element to it. You know, this isn't a straight up horror novel. And while that's largely what Stephen King is known for, this series has had a huge impact, I would say, in the sort of fantasy book world. And I don't know how much it dives into that element in later books, but this, just the fact that the Man in Black can, you know, bring this kid from the dead and plant him here. And it doesn't even seem like he's from the same universe, really. That's something that's a little iffy with me because it seems like the universe that The Stand is in is clearly not the universe that a lot of his other books are set in, because everything is not perfectly fine in those books, but you know, the world wasn't decimated by a disease.
Yeah. It's funny though because within like the Dark Tower series you do see these hints or these glimpses of the past and like things that we recognize from our own time even, but that are so like far gone and very much a part of the past in this universe and in this series. Like the one song that everybody seems to know is Hey Jude by the Beatles.
Yeah.
Like why is that something that survived into this universe or this world that they're inhabiting? It's hard because I have read further into the series, so there are things that you're like questioning or talking about, and
And you know the answers.
I kind of know where it's headed, and I don't want to spoil it for you because I want you to be able to discover it as you're reading.
I greatly appreciate that. Although if you want to give me any hints, I think that would be acceptable
Hints are hard though.
without giving it away. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that just goes to show how well he has been able to intertwine these stories. And when I was reading this book, there was actually the afterword. And he was like, you know, I have like 3,000 pages of story for this story that I want to tell with the Dark Tower series. And I was thinking, I was like, okay, this one's only, you know, 200 to 300 pages, depending on what copy you have. So who knows what his page count is when you account for different printings and everything like that. But
Mm-hmm.
then I was like, all right, I know some of his books can get to be 1,000 pages or so, but I would venture to say that a lot of the Dark Tower books are in that sort of higher 500 to 700 range.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
And if you think about that and the fact that he has now done 8 different books, that's over 3,000 pages, if I'm not mistaken, if I am doing some quick math in my head correctly. And it's just one of those things where it's like, how do you know when you start this that you have that much story you want to tell, especially with something like this where, I feel like at this point, this told a pretty good story in and of itself. And I would have been okay sort of only getting 1 or 2 more books after this, but to know that I have 7 more to read, it kind of just gets my mind spinning with all the possibilities. And I know that probably some of what I'm thinking is absolutely incorrect, which is fine. Speculation is part of the fun with going through these, knowing that there are going to be connections down the line.
Yeah, it all ties in together, and he's really great at wrapping things. Not, I mean, I can't say wrapping things up because I haven't gotten to the end yet, but he's really great at forming these ties between books and weaving this story and continuing it in a way that doesn't feel like it's all really dragged out, but that it all still feels connected.
I would say this book specifically felt very concise. And like I already mentioned, it's a lot shorter than most of his books. This is actually getting pretty close to novella territory for at least the copy you read, if it was only around 200 pages, because some of his novellas will be, 80 to 150 pages, give or take a handful of
Yeah.
pages there. But it was one of those things where it's like, okay, he introduced these characters and he gave us a complete story, even though the story wasn't finished. It was sort of this complete section of the story, I guess is a better way to put it, because you have him going and meeting Brown and his crow Zoltan, because I guess,
Everybody has a crow.
yeah, I guess so. And their crows all have strange names.
Yeah.
And so he goes and tells this story, and he doesn't leave you hanging too much. We know he still wants to go after the man in black. And I like that it wraps it up without wrapping it up.
Yeah. It's cool that it is kind of its own complete story, but it is still open ended enough to continue on to the next book. These books
Yeah.
take some weird turns. I'm not gonna lie.
That doesn't surprise me because I have heard that about some of the other books where I know the general story or I've seen the movie or TV show adaptations, but then when you read the book, you're like, oh, okay, all right, that's a thing that happened, and I know I'm going to feel that way once I get to it as well, just because I feel like I know the gist of the story, but I feel like the adaptations haven't quite given you the whole story yet, especially
Probably
with
not.
the new version of it having a chapter 2 portion to it. So I was like, okay, all right, I have my work cut out for me because it is a ginormous book. And I imagine that no matter how you try to adapt that book, you can't fit everything into a movie or, mini TV series, which is what they did back in whenever they did that in the 90s, I believe it is.
Yeah, I've only ever seen the new It. I haven't seen any other adaptations of it because I don't do well with horror. So
I think you're fine only having seen the new one, to be honest. I like that one a lot better.
I heard that it was scarier than the original, though.
That sounds accurate because the original is kind of cheesy at times because it was, the 90s. So
Right.
it's definitely interesting to compare the two. But I know you don't like horror, so I'm not going to recommend
No.
you go back and watch the Tim Curry version of Pennywise. But I think with something like this is sort of his version of Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, is how I feel this series is going to go. While it might not have, as predictable of solutions to things and more twists and turns than, Harry Potter does, because that's something that is meant for kids to follow along with. I think it's sort of in the same vein.
Yeah, this is kind of his epic almost.
Yeah.
It's that whole fantasy, like very long journey adventure kind of feel. So I think that's accurate. to say that it's like his Lord of the Rings, especially comparing to Lord of the Rings. I feel like that's a good fit.
Yeah, I honestly have not read those books just yet. They are sitting on my shelf right now. I read The Hobbit and I watched all of the Lord of the Rings movies, but I have not made my way through the books just yet.
I can summarize them for you.
They
They
go
do
on
a
a
lot of
long
walking.
journey.
Yeah, they go on a long journey and do a lot of walking. I did read those.
I'll get to it eventually.
I enjoyed them, but it is essentially they do some walking, they do some other stuff, they go back to doing more walking.
To be fair, the Gunslinger does exactly that in this book too. It's just not nearly as long.
Yes, the walking in the Gunslinger is condensed a little bit.
I think it helps that he didn't focus so much on the walking too. He
Yeah,
focused on sort of the surroundings and the fact that Jake was with him, and then he was telling Jake stories about his past, which gives you the flashbacks within the flashback. And I think that helped pass the time a lot because he would tell this story and you would sort of get lost in his past for a bit, and then you'd return and they would be like, oh, now we're at this point and
yeah,
we only have this far to go, or they run into the man in black in one of the instances and it sort of picks up the action again and you're like, oh, okay, this is interesting. So I feel like the flashbacks within the flashback were a great way to keep your attention but draw you away from the story at hand a little and give you more background information that is pretty necessary to understanding who the gunslinger is.
yeah. It definitely it helps kind of further the plot along and get them from point A to point B without it feeling drawn out.
Yeah, so I feel like I've repeated myself a few times here on, the gunslinger and his story, but I do want to talk about our favorite moment or moments in the book before we wrap this up. I know because this book is a little shorter, there's not quite as much to say about it as I'm sure I will have with some of the other Dark Tower books down the line as they get longer. But with this one, I felt like there were some really nice moments in it, but I will let you go first.
I liked The Gunslinger, but out of the books that I have read in this series, I didn't like it's not my favorite.
Right.
I read it just because it's the first book in the series and you should read them in order and read all of them. But to be honest, I like
It's a lot of setup for the
yeah,
story.
it is a lot of setup and it's the kind of thing where like it's almost surprising that I kept going
Okay.
considering how like I said I liked it but I wasn't super enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, for me, I don't have a ton to say about favorite moments, but I think when they were going through this area and they were being attacked and when Jake was showing how scared he was, to me it was just like, okay, this kid might be dead, but he's still full of emotion and he's still trying to figure out how to survive even in death. And
Yeah.
that just really shined through in that moment. And you had Roland trying to shoot all of, these things coming up at them. And Jake was just terrified. And you could really feel that through King's writing of that section.
If you're going to pick a favorite, that's a good one. I guess I did like when right after this and right after Jake has been sacrificed, Roland finally does catch up with the man in black and they spend the entire night sitting up talking.
Yeah. And then it feels like 10 years by the time Roland gets out of there.
Yeah. And I thought that was another cool way of playing with time and it's just like it's another way that Stephen King kind of shows you that time isn't what you expect it to be in these books.
Yeah, and the creatures were called the Slow Mutants. It was escaping me while I was talking about it, but I was like,
Yes.
I know they had a name.
Yeah, which I wasn't quite sure what they were actually supposed to be. Like, are they mutant humans that live in the mountain?
It's funny because they're described as subterranean creatures, so I think there was some water at some point when they were going down the railroad tracks,
Mm-hmm.
and they were to me it felt like they were coming up out of this like swampy area almost, which is a stark difference from the desert. So I was also a little confused on that section, but I think what he was able to do with Jake in that moment was sort of what made me not question that quite as much until now, to be honest with you.
Yeah, which says a lot about his writing, that it's good enough that it distracts you from these weird discrepancies that you might otherwise question.
Yeah, and honestly, sometimes when I'm reading a book, some things just slip by me. And it's one of those things where, as I'm doing this podcast, it's always great to get someone else's perspective and sort of see if they caught anything that you missed, because this is a lot of reading, to say the least. And I feel like my brain is going to be a jumbled mess by the time I manage to make my way through the end of this. Hopefully that happens. I'm really trying to get all the way through this. It's a very long process.
Yeah, it is a long, long process.
Yeah, well, do you have any final thoughts about the book, Becky? I know, with this not being your favorite one, it's sometimes it's a little harder to talk about the ones you don't like quite as much as some others.
Yeah. Like I said, I did like it. It's very much a setup for the rest of the series, so it's a little bit hard to get through sometimes. But I am glad that I kept going because, and it's funny to say it, but like by book 3, I think that's where I was really getting into it.
Okay.
Most people wouldn't continue a series if the first 2 books didn't like jump out at them. But, Stephen King's writing is so detailed, and his universes, these worlds are so well thought out that it's hard not to get sucked into them.
Yeah, it really amazes me what he strings along throughout his books, because I'll
Yeah.
see random trivia questions like, oh, which 3 books was Christine mentioned in? And obviously there's a book called Christine. So that's obvious answer number
It's like the
1. But then I was
giveaway.
like, wait, Christine's mentioned in other books?
Yeah, it's cool that he's able to do that and kind of tie things together. And I wish I knew how the Dark Tower series fits in with the rest of his body of work.
To be fair, I still don't know how that ties in. I mean, I know I'm only just starting the Dark Tower series, only having read The Stand and this one, but I am hoping to figure that out as I go. If not, someone on Reddit will have an answer.
Yeah, I'm sure there's somebody on the internet who has written about it at length.
For sure. Well, Becky, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. I am looking forward to somewhat catching up to you. Maybe you'll finish this by the time we get through our 4 episodes on it or something that we have planned.
Yeah, I need to get back to that. I need to get back to these. I took a break because they're very dense books,
Yeah.
and some of like the material within them can be a little bit heavy at times, just like very dark and kind of emotionally draining. So I
Yeah.
needed to take a break and read some lighter things. So I need to.
That's like me with watching The Sopranos. I take very, very long breaks in between binge watching seasons. I still have to watch season 6, and that I'll have that done by the time everyone is hearing this episode. But it's one of those things where I was like, man, that was exhausting. I need a break for a while.
It gets heavy. So I took a break. I'm gonna go back to it. I do own all of the books. I got them for Christmas last year.
Nice.
So I'm gonna go back to those and finish this up.
That's awesome. Well, I look forward to our next episode, and hopefully you get to some of my recommended non-horror reading for you.
Yes.
And we can see if there's anything else for you to come on to discuss. But to our listeners, as always, thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.